Hello and welcome back to the World Pipelines podcast, a podcast for pipeliners featuring the brightest and best, most experienced, most forward-thinking minds in the oil and gas pipeline industry. I'm Elizabeth Corner, and I'm thrilled to bring you a series of conversations with experts from across the sector. In each episode, we'll be talking about some of the latest challenges, trends, and innovations affecting pipelines worldwide. The goal here is simple: to give you real-world perspectives on the topics that shape our industry. Oilfield Technology keeps upstream oil and gas professionals up to date on the latest technologies and developments in the industry through in-depth articles, regional reports, and project news. Sign up to our newsletter at oilfieldtechnology.com/newsletter for a free copy of each issue. For this episode, I am pleased to welcome Ross Brewer, Vice President and Managing Director for Europe, Middle East and Africa at Graylog. Hello and welcome, Ross.
Hello, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure.
Now, Ross has nearly 40 years of experience in cybersecurity and information technology under his belt, and he has advised governments, enterprises, and senior leaders around the world on how to strengthen their cyber resilience. Originally from New Zealand and now based in the UK, Ross has held senior leadership positions at some of the industry's most influential organizations, including SimSpace, Attack IQ, Logarithm, NetIQ, and Symantec. At Graylog, Ross focuses on helping organizations gain greater visibility and confidence in their security operations, ensuring that systems and data remain protected in what is an increasingly complex digital landscape. Now, Ross, before we dive into the specifics of cybersecurity for pipelines, can you give us a high-level overview of what Graylog does? So for those who may not be familiar, how would you describe the platform?
Certainly. So for the pipeline and energy industry, first and foremost, every technology, whether that be on the OT side or the IT side, the operations technology or the information technology side of their businesses, all of those systems are producing audit logs or log data, and the technology is known in the industry as a security information and event management platform. So we're a modern SIM. We collect all of that data from all the different systems in many different formats at very large volumes, and we consolidate that so that we can help organizations in their security operations center or their network operations center more effectively chase down threats and problems in the environment, respond very quickly to those through rapid search, and then help them do better investigation, better incident management as far as outages and cybersecurity incidents go.
And can you describe for us the biggest challenges that pipeline operators are facing today when it comes to managing and protecting their data and operations? How does that landscape look in 2025?
Well, the pipeline industry's got several unique inputs that are impacting their sort of risk profile as it relates to cybersecurity. The geopolitical situation that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, clearly that is coming at them from every angle. The certain government actors are focusing on critical national infrastructure and some sort of long-term acquisition strategy to get into these environments. And then we're just seeing the normal criminal networks and with the likes of Colonial Pipeline in 2021, where anything that can cause mass outage or impact on society that can be ransomed or held against an organization politically or commercially is increasing. And then they've got the problem where having to move to more decarbonized situations that's moving them to more modern technology. Those modern technologies come with a lot more connectivity than their legacy systems. So we've just got this confluence of things that are really impacting the energy sector and the pipeline sector specifically, and we're just seeing an increased risk profile within that sector because of that. And then we're seeing a increasing number of regulations targeting the sector, not specifically with NIS2 in Europe, but some of the more energy-focused safety standards that are coming through. And so this is making it very challenging for organizations in this space.
Yes, a lot of different angles on that one, things coming at us from all areas. So, for pipeline operators who are perhaps still in the early stages of wanting and needing to strengthen their cybersecurity position, what kind of advice would you offer to them?
Well, they want to make sure that they're starting out with a sort of a risk assessment of their environment, and then they want to make sure that they're ticking off the usual suspects, strong authentication, two-factor authentication, making sure they've got adequate access controls in place. Make sure they don't fall under the misconception that their IT networks are separated from the operation technology networks, because a number of suppliers now, as these technologies become more IP-based, then the suppliers have connectivity into those environments. So they've really got to look at the supply chain, making sure that they're assessing their suppliers from an information security standard, and then making sure that they're monitoring and assessing those suppliers on an ongoing basis. Because when you look at the big failures recently with Jaguar Land Rover, a lot of the retailers in the UK, it wasn't specifically their networks that were actually gone after initially. It was actually the suppliers that were gone after, and the supply chain was leveraged to get into those organizations and create havoc. So this making sure that they're assessing on a regular basis all of those aspects is critical.
We've always been taught, Ross, that connectivity is the best thing ever, right? So when you're telling me that that's not actually the case.
Well, it's difficult in cybersecurity because we get to a situation, and I have seen, in fact, I did deal with a person at a very well-known petrochemical company that might be based in Saudi Arabia, who was actually the individual that when they got hit a few years ago, he took the personal step of pulling the cables out of the wall in the data center without authority, because he felt he could stop the actual spread of the ransomware or the malware at the time that it was. And he was lucky. He did slow the spread down, although they were massively impacted. He did personally slow the spread down. So yes, the only safe cybersecurity platform is a system that's not connected to anything, and obviously that's not good for business, and that doesn't work. So we've just got to deal with the fact that connectivity is key, but with it comes the risk that we've been outlining through this discussion.
Fantastic. This is someone else's anecdote, actually, but I do remember talking to someone who said that he could print from his facility anywhere in the world, and it was that very connection that it fact maybe was making the company vulnerable. We are recording this episode a couple of weeks after the global AWS outage, and that caused a significant ripple across global systems, including those that manage energy, manage pipelines. And I want to talk a bit about cloud-based infrastructure. So how resilient is cloud-based infrastructure in the face of outages such as this?
Well, generally speaking, cloud-based infrastructure is going to be more resilient than you can possibly manage on site. That's the theory. Now, you would hope that the organizations, the major logos, AWS, Microsoft, Google, running the big Oracle, possibly running the big cloud infrastructures, are going to have more skill and more reputational risk at the sort of level that they're operating at, where they're going to be applying the absolute best operational standards that you can possibly think of, both from an uptime standpoint and a cybersecurity standpoint. However, now they've become such colossal providers, any failure in their environment has such broad ramifications. So what we're seeing organizations doing is taking a hybrid approach. Most of our customers have a mixture of Microsoft, Google, and AWS. Typically, AWS is running their core sort of applications, Microsoft running their sort of front office and Active Directory, and then Google perhaps running some large processing systems that require a large amount of compute. Now, the majority of Graylog's customers, though, especially in the energy sector, tend to still be focused on what we class as self-managed. Now, what this means is not necessarily on-prem, but the customers are concerned about data sovereignty. So they want to be able to make sure that this data isn't sitting in a shared environment that could ever possibly be compromised. So they might put it on-prem, they might put it into private cloud, or they may have a partner manage that on their behalf. And that's the majority of our customers. We do have a software as a service, a cloud offering. Even that said, that, as I said, most of our customers, more than 95%, run in what we class as self-managed.
That does lead me on to my next question, which is about the decision to go fully cloud. So many energy companies are thinking about going fully cloud. As you mentioned, they're a little nervous about that. They perhaps want to maintain on-premises infrastructure. How should pipeline operators evaluate the risks and the benefits of going with either of those deployment models?
I think they have to evaluate the risks in a similar way that we spoke about for themselves. Obviously, making sure that they're looking very closely at their suppliers, making sure that they're contractually holding those suppliers to account with penalties should they fail to deliver against those SLAs, and then making sure that they're dealing with organizations that have experience in the regions and geolocations that are important to those organizations.
Absolutely. Let's imagine that a breach has occurred in the pipeline sector. What is the typical first step in your response plan? So how does Graylog help operators react after incidents?
I once was dealing with a very high profile mentor that mentored high level people. And one of those people was president of the US. And the president came to him about a particular incident and said, look, we've got a major PR problem. I've done something that I shouldn't have, and I need your help. And his advice to the president at the time was, you should have spoke to me before you did it, and I would have told you not to do it. So what I'm trying to say here is that it doesn't start at the time of breach. It's got to start well before that. And this is the message that we need to get across to all operators. They need to make sure that they're securing their systems. They're going to make sure that they're putting adequate monitoring in place. They're going to make sure that they're maintaining those records over long periods of time in a way that they can access them rapidly when they need them and not go scrambling for them after the fact when they don't have them. And it's the same thing with their incident response plan. Don't go into an incident and then go, okay, what's our plan? You want to make sure that you've rehearsed your incident response plan. You've rehearsed what you're going to do with the press, because often what happens without adequate preparation, it leads to what we call over-disclosure. We saw that in the Phones for You incident. The CEO came out and said, we've potentially lost 4 million customers' records of personally identifiable information. And the government was talking about holding an inquest, and the cameras was in the CEO's face at the time, and that had profound impact on the actual organization. But what actually happened was, a few weeks later, once the incident investigation had taken place, there was 12,000 records. Now, no one reads that press release in 4 weeks' time that says there was only 12,000 records. Everyone remembers the 4 million records, and everybody that was a customer felt that their data was lost and was upset with that brand. And so this over-disclosure and these kind of problems come from not being prepared. So once they are prepared and they have that incident, they want to invoke their incident response plan. Depending on how serious they think it is, they may want to bring in external parties that they already have on contract and available that can be called urgently. You don't want to go scrambling for those parties at the time of a breach, and then work through the breach in a systematic way to, identify what resources have been compromised, where the attackers have been, what assets or what data has been exfiltrated, and then make the appropriate publications to, whether it be the SEC from, if you're in the US operating on the US share market, or the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, or whatever regulatory bodies appropriate in their jurisdiction.
Such an important message for pipeline operators. And do you find that a lot of your job is convincing people of the seriousness of this, of kind of trying to convert them to understanding that, in fact, a lot of work needs to be done when the risk isn't apparent?
I think we're in a very different position today. If I think back to the sort of early 90s, the mid 90s, the early 2000s, yes, we were on a sort of a crusade, if you will, to try and educate people on the risks, because we could see it. I remember trying to go into countries like Denmark and Sweden and trying to explain, or Norway, trying to explain that there's these bad people. You leave your house open, there's not bad people in their societies back 20 years ago. And you left your door open and that you knew everybody. And so crime just wasn't even a thing in the psyche. And you're trying to say, hey, there's these big bad people on the internet and they're going to get your data and they're going to collapse your business. And honestly, they just didn't comprehend or really get it back in the day, like in San Francisco, seeing it in the street. And so I think now it's become so prolific that I think our education is less so. We don't have to sort of educate people on this. As we used to use this term, it's not a case of if, it's when you get breached. I think most executives now know that cybersecurity is a sort of a top 3 risk within any organization, possibly the number 1 risk. The challenge is that they don't understand enough about the problem to adequately resource it and fund it. And I think that's where boards need more representation, less representation from financial people and a little bit more representation from technology people that understand that risk and can fund the programs appropriately.
Yes, quite. Now, one of the new challenges we're facing is we are integrating smart technology, smart sensors into pipeline networks. We're very keen on that. But obviously, these innovations do perhaps introduce new levels of vulnerability. Is that correct?
Yes, there was I think it was Garrett, I'm trying to remember the singer that sung it, but in his song he says, there were some smart bombs and there were some dumb ones too. And Gil Scott Heron, was it? Anyway, and if you think about the smart technology, yes, it's called smart technology. We're moving rapidly to IP-based, but the suppliers of a lot of the IoT, the Internet of Things, and a lot of the control technologies are not paying enough attention to the cybersecurity aspect, and they're trying to gather telemetry that makes them more valuable as companies, but that telemetry opens up the risk to some of the customers that are using their technology. So we've seen in the European Union has introduced standards with respect to IoT and better cybersecurity. So I think we've got some way to go, because on the OT side of the business, there isn't the same. There's very few actual specific malware strains that are targeting OT. So it's not as bad as the IT side of the network. It's a long way from it. So I think the risks are less, therefore people pay a little less attention to it. I think that needs to change as these networks and the cloud all become one. And there's no such thing as a border anymore within these environments.
Oh, that is a good quote. Now, I'm interested in specifically how a cyber criminal, a bad actor, could exploit the interconnectedness of pipeline networks, the way that they're connected across locations globally, you touched on earlier. Are you able to share a scenario where a cross-border vulnerability has played a role?
We've just seen that in the airline industry most recently. So the outage of Heathrow and Brussels and other airports was an example of a cross-border situation. And if we look at the outage at AWS a few weeks ago, again, that was global. And so if we just come back to the cross-border one for a second, this is why it's important to look at these suppliers, and that's what the cyber criminals are doing now. They're trying to find common suppliers that will get them in across the industry, not into a particular organization. And then when you think about what happened with AWS, people think that, if you were in the East, US East as it's called, data centers or data center or region or zone or whatever you want to call it, then you were impacted. And if you weren't in that area, you were okay. Actually, that's the pivotal point that AWS manages a lot of their DNS for their global environments from. So bringing down or impacting that environment will have profound impacts around multiple geos around the world and that. So we're seeing some of the Russians and Chinese go after the critical national infrastructure, specifically energy, specifically utilities, and they're trying to embed themselves in those networks just in case we believe, or the industry believes, just in case there's some form of activity and they want to be able to show their hand or cause the US. This is very strong in the US and the UK. So whether at some point they want to show their hand and slow the US or the UK down, but it hasn't yet been determined why they're trying to compromise these networks and lay dormant over a period of multiple years. So I think, again, this is something that the pipeline and the energy industries got to be acutely attuned to, that the nation state actors are specifically targeting them and then just targeting them because they're critical infrastructure.
Fascinating stuff. Is there a growing trend in pipeline security where criminal groups are more targeted and more bold in their attacks? So a few years ago, I interviewed Sam Miorelli from Siemens Energy, and I put it to him that the likelihood of cyber attacks had increased. This was about 2022. And he said, no, he didn't think that cyber attacks were increasing. He just suggested that awareness had increased instead. Is that still the case?
Obviously it's different now, and I'll go into that. And I would disagree with that statement at that time. We've been I just did a presentation on Friday and I covered the 30 years of logging and monitoring and how we started out in the 90s and up until 2025. And it's been a sort of an upward trajectory of increasing veracity and volume and sophistication and impact of attacks. So, however, if you go through the last sort of 5 years with the sort of Ukraine activity, with what's happening in North Korea, with the Trump interaction with the Chinese, the tariffs, and then if we look at Iran, we've certainly seen a massive focus and uptick in the energy sector and the pipeline industry just because of the geopolitical situation that's gone on. And then the cyber criminals are getting more emboldened and going after bigger targets. And yes, of course, we're getting more communication and people are making it more public and there's more regulations. More than 95% of breaches used to go underreported back in the day. So yeah, I agree with the statement that we're seeing better reporting, which makes it look worse. But no, it is worse. There's more than 500 criminal gangs being tracked by the intelligence agencies around the world at the moment, and they wreaking havoc on a daily basis. And the crazy thing is that people don't realize that they're already in their networks and they're running at risk on a day-to-day basis without the visibility and the analytics to look for the telltale signs of the behaviors of these criminal actors and to cut them off at the knees before their initial activity turns into a headline.
Absolutely. Sobering stuff. Right, we'll go for some quick fire now, shall we? Well, let's see how quick fire we can be. So I wanted to ask you about insider threats. We've been talking about outside threats. How significant is the risk of insider threats when it comes to pipeline security? So could an employee or a contractor with access to some critical systems potentially cause more damage than a cyber criminal group?
Insider threats are always a concern, and they typically know more about the environment, so they can help bad actors get to assets of value or interrupt the business in more impactful ways. And we saw there was even most recently in the last few months, a BBC reporter was offered a large sum of money to turn on the organisation he represented. And it just seems how crazy to ask somebody at that level within an organisation of that type, who's someone who's so publicly facing. So it just shows how these criminal gangs, how emboldened they'll become and how they'll do anything to get into any organisation. And the insider threat's always a concern, but typically it's more to do with the disgruntled employee that possibly knows a lot about the network and can cause havoc. And so therefore, this is why the access controls and making sure that the policies and procedures are in place for levers that get taken off the systems and their access cut. And because sometimes that access is, people give too much access too widely to too many people, and then when they leave, some of that access remains in place. So I think just general hygiene is critical in this environment.
Yes, good housekeeping is needed in that department for sure. Okay, so I can sense that there is perhaps a tension between bolstering cybersecurity and then maintaining your operational efficiency. A lot of operators might resist putting into place new cybersecurity protocols if they think that they might disrupt workflow or slow things down. So, how do you strike the balance between tightening security and keeping those operations smooth?
Well, I think the risk assessment is key to that from the outset, understanding what it is that the organization's trying to protect, what is the likely scenario of it being impacted. You don't build $1 million fence around $1 asset. Okay, so everything has to be proportionate to the level of risk and the level of value that you're trying to protect. As sad as it sounds, some construction companies might get fined $10 million for knocking down a building that's listed. Just knock it down, and the building that we're building is worth $500 million. So that's just a cost of doing business. Now, obviously, that's not what we'd encourage, but you've got to make sure that the investment that you're making is representative of the problem and the risk of actually the event happening. And I think the organizations, unfortunately, because boards are mostly made up of financial experienced people, they find it hard to quantify what would happen if there was a cyber outage. And I think what they want to do is look at that from a business impact standpoint. They will know how much, like Dark Side Colonial Pipeline, know what their daily volumes were and would have been able to say it's $10 million a day or $1 million a day or whatever. So once you quantify that value, then you can start to think about, okay, what would we need to do to pay to protect that and stop that from happening? So in the case of Jaguar Land Rover, I believe they made it public that it was $30 million a day now, and that went on for a month. And then you look at all the suppliers that were impacted, and you look at the UK economy that was impacted, and it's, okay, was that worth an extra couple of $1 million spent on cybersecurity to analyze our suppliers to make sure we weren't at risk? Yes, maybe. But look, we're all billionaires with the crystal ball of hindsight. But I think getting ahead of this is making sure that organizations bring in experts that can assess their network, exercise their controls, make sure that their monitoring picks up that activity, and then making sure that their teams are responding rapidly from an incident response standpoint.
Fantastic. Now, I think it's pretty much illegal to do a podcast episode without using the phrase AI. So let's talk about AI, shall we? How ready are current AI solutions for interlocking into cybersecurity? Is that the picture? Is that what we're looking at? Is AI something that's going to be the future of cybersecurity?
Well, AI is going to have a profound impact on cybersecurity, but it might not be in the ways that people are hoping. I'm optimistic, and I remain optimistic, but people are racing to these technologies so rapidly, and they're relying on them now to do coding. And yes, these systems are good at coding, but it's rudimentary coding that they're doing rapidly because you're not paying enough for them to do it properly. So yes, they can rudimentarily code something. It's getting more sophisticated, but with that, it comes the risks of what we've been dealing with for the last 50 years, which is developers not building in cybersecurity into their coding. And so that's the one aspect that we're going to see risk in the code that's developed. Another aspect is we don't know what we don't know. So we're going to put this magical system on our networks that's going to monitor and tell us it's doing everything to monitor for bad behavior and stop that bad behavior. But these systems hallucinate. They tell you what you want to hear at the moment. And if you ask it the same question 3 or 4 different times, you'll get 4 or 5 different answers. And in cybersecurity, there are certain patterns that, yes, you could respond to, like phishing, spam, things like that. But a lot of what we deal with is we don't know what the incident's going to look like until it happens. And so these systems that work on patterns, pattern recognition, pattern learning are not so well suited to the likes of cybersecurity, where the networks are complex. They're all different. The workflow's different. Everything's different in every environment, even on every day. the networks are changing and the complexity is changing. So AI is going to be helpful and useful, and we're embedding AI into our platform so you can ask questions in plain English and it will interpret those and go after the right data for you. However, the downside to AI is where the hackers start to use it to speed up their ability to compromise organizations at scale. Their code doesn't have to be perfect, it's just got to work. So they don't care if they're using something to create code that's not bulletproof as long as it achieves their objective. So I think we're going to see an escalation in speed. And I think the big warning that I would put out to anyone in IT or anyone on a board of any company at the moment is be very careful, because what you're doing, most people are trying to build their infrastructure and their response to what's happening today, whereas actually what you've got to be doing is what is happening in the next 2 to 5 years. And if you look at the trajectory that we're on, obviously with this massive increase in speed and velocity and veracity, then we've got to make sure that we're thinking much further ahead than today, because these AI technologies are going to take us to that place a lot quicker than we expected.
Great answer. My last question is about, I think it's about downtime, really. So pipeline operators are always worried about downtime. If a pipeline is under cyber attack, but taking it offline would have huge consequences economically, environmentally. How do you make the right decision on what to do to protect your system or protect the asset? How does that work?
Well, making the right decision in the middle of an incident depends on the data that you have at your fingertips. And this is why being prepared way in advance with your incident response, making sure that you're collecting adequate log data from all the different systems so that you can quickly analyze where things have gone wrong, where data's been copied to, what systems have been impacted, and then making sure that you have rehearsed that plan. And there's a term that they use in the military, and it's fighting while wounded. So it's not a case of making sure that you get everything back to how it is. You've really just got to make sure that you can isolate systems that are impacted and that you can carry on your business without having to, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, pull the cables out of the wall, that you can actually operate the business. So this comes down to how the business designs its infrastructure and making sure that you don't have single points of failure where you're reliant on a single technology at a single point, and that you have redundancy and resiliency built into your operations, so that especially in terms of monitoring and threat detection, incident response, all of these areas, making sure that they're on an enclave that's separate to the rest of your environment. So should your OT environment be impacted, that your security operations center doesn't get impacted, so they still have the visibility and can still help executives have those discussions to say, look, where do we think this has happened? What do we need to do to isolate it? Can we continue to fight the fight? In other words, can our business continue to operate even though we've taken a shot to the shoulder kind of thing?
Thank you so much for all of your expertise today, Ross. That has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope this was interesting, Elizabeth, and you have a great day.
That was Ross Brewer at Graylog, giving us an invigorating, very up-to-date take on cybersecurity for pipelines and energy assets. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to the World Pipelines podcast for free wherever you get your podcasts. If you have enjoyed this episode, please rate and review and forward to a colleague or friend. Oilfields Technology keeps upstream oil and gas professionals up to date on the latest technologies and developments in the industry through in-depth articles, regional reports, and project news. Sign up to our newsletter at oilfieldstechnology.com/newsletter for a free copy of each issue.